as a culture, like, we hold tight to our epiphanies because, well, it's easier, right? I think than the reality, which is that persuasion takes a lot of time. It's incremental. And, like, it's really hard to track. Who fucking knows exactly when you are persuaded to think something or do something new?
Some people aren't going to like you. I remember thinking, like, yeah, I'm definitely not going to stand up in front of an audience and be like, I command you to whatever.
Oh, well, you had to be there. No, I didn't, because that's why we invented stories. So I, in fact, didn't gotta be there.
What's up, rhetoric nerds? Welcome back to Rhetorically Speaking, a podcast where we are committed to banishing banality one speech at a time. I said we like I have a team. It's just me. I am your hostess with the mostest, rhetoric professor Lee Pierce, she, they pronouns, enemy of cliches. Surprisingly, I am also a lover of bland-ass cutout sugar cookies. Ironic, because they are the cliche of cookies. And most importantly, loather of the epiphany. Now, that's a controversial thing to say, headed into the new year, because every one of you is about to insist that you have had an epiphany. Even though calendars are made up and dates are arbitrary, still, you will not be able to resist convincing yourself that the changing of the fourth number of the yearly clock somehow gives you superhuman willpower and insight. Right, that's the epiphany. People often think that an epiphany is a rhetorical device, like epistrophe or epizeuxis. I know, there's so many. But it's not, because like all critical thinking shortcuts, it was made up by Christianity. An epiphany, as it appears in Matthew 2:1-2:12, I know, are you impressed, is the manifestation of Christ to the Gentiles. And I mean, it happens other places, like Moses in the burning bush, that whole thing. It broadly means the manifestation of a divine being. But it has come to mean, in our secular world, just sort of a sudden moment of clarity or knowledge. Epiphanies manifest themselves in our public discourse through the absolutely loathsome phrase, and suddenly everything changed. And I actually covered, FYI, I covered a version of the epiphany back in episode 5 when I discussed the cliche rock bottom moment in the film Brittany Runs a Marathon. That's another good episode of caution for all of you wannabe resolutionists. The thing about epiphanies is that they only work if you live in a world where there are, in fact, divine beings. Magic, where genies grant wishes, or gods intervene and change the course of history dressed up like human beings. Now, if you believe in that stuff, in divine miracles, like literally divine miracles, not metaphorically, literally, then, by all means, keep your epiphanies, wait for God to reveal herself to you. But for those of us living in the secular world, epiphanies are just a persuasive shortcut. A secular epiphany would mean just a total revolution of thought that happens instantaneously inside someone's brain. So you would spend years believing or doing one thing, like overeating after dinner. Then you have an epiphany, like a New Year's resolution. And then you suddenly believe or do something completely different for the rest of your life. Not likely. And that is why, in the 2,000 plus years, rhetoric as a discipline never added epiphany to its never-ending list of persuasive strategies. Because rhetoric is about the messy work of using language in a secular world where there is no God to solve our problems to persuade other people. An epiphany is just a shortcut through all of that mess that doesn't get the job done. That said, rhetoric does have a version of the epiphany. It is called peripeteia. Peripeteia. And it means a sudden reversal of fortune. Now that sounds like an epiphany, right? God shows up, reverses your fortune suddenly, and now you don't blow your unemployment check on hookers anymore. But that's your Christian brain thinking. Oh, that's funny. Not your pre-monotheism rhetorical brain thinking, right? The difference between an epiphany and a peripeteia is that the peripeteia is not the moment when you suddenly start acting like a whole new person. That idea of just this sudden transformation is incredibly modern. Capitalism loves that idea. because it gets you to buy diet programs and online courses and home remodels and all kind of shit, hoping that will be your peripatetic moment, right? Hoping it will give you an epiphany. If I get the home remodel, then I'll be happy. Right? The sudden reversal of fortune. Prior to God and capitalism, people could not have even believed that horseshit. And I'm not fetishizing like Greek democracy or whatever. They had a lot of problems. I'm just saying they did get their rhetoric. What they believed in was fate. Fate could reverse your fortune. You could call it luck, you could call it chance, but essentially the reversal of fortune is an event that sets in motion the need for you to choose where you might not have had to choose before. Let me give you an example. In the movie Sliding Doors with Gwyneth Paltrow, she's in a crap relationship, doesn't know it, in a crap job she thinks she likes, right? And then one day, she's running for a train. And then the movie splits. So half the movie shows her life if she had made the train. And then the other half is her life if she had not made the train. Spoiler alert, in the version where she makes the train, a lot of seemingly great stuff happens that ends up horrible in the end. In the version where she does not make the train, a lot of seemingly awful stuff happens that ends up wonderful in the end, right? The peripeteia was the moment she did not or made the train. It's the sudden reversal of fortune. It is not what Paltrow's character did or did not do in response, right? So the peripeteia is her missing the train. It's not her suddenly deciding to blah, blah, blah. And this is the big lesson about peripeteias. You can notice them in hindsight. You can look back on your life and see these events that showed up and changed the course of your life, but you rarely know them when they're happening. And even some of the things that we talk about as if they're like life-shattering and the moment everything changed, right? 9/11, people call 9/11 the moment everything changed. The COVID pandemic, right? That's going to be a moment that everything changed. They may not be peripatetic for some people. It's really all in how you think and talk about them. But if you decide that they are peripatetic, remember that they have to be an event that set in motion an alternate course of events. It's something that happens in the world, not how you react. When people tell stories and they use the cliche, suddenly everything changed, they're always putting the peripeteia in the wrong place. Most people use peripeteia to mean the moment they changed in response to the event that changed them, right? The epiphany and the peripeteia get collapsed. They use them interchangeably. Example, my mother died and suddenly everything changed. Well, maybe, right? Your mother dying may have been a peripatetic event if it was also a sudden reversal of fortune. But it's highly unlikely that in the moment you, quote, suddenly changed, it stuck with you. Like, actually what happened is you probably got really sad, called into work, helped make funeral arrangements, got through the events with a blur, exhaustedly cleaned out her house, eventually kind of got back to your life. And I know, because that's exactly what happened to me. So what changed? Like, where's the epiphany? Sure, over time, you may have made different choices because of how you thought about the loss of your mother. I can say for sure that over the years, I have been a little more brazen, a little less give a fuck, because I saw just how well obedience and a life of service wound up for my dead mom. But that all happened in tiny moments and small decisions that happened over years. And there were lots of other not better decisions. Because for the most part, I just kind of kept doing all the stuff I'd already done, right? People pleasing, putting up with shitty relationships, because that's what I had practiced. So even if in the moment that I'm sitting in the funeral, I have this epiphany, what's to say it's going to be any more than just a thought, right? Who's to say it's going to stick? Now, as much as I love talking about my complex thoughts about my dead mother, I figure you could probably use a more relevant example. So, here is President-elect Joe Biden's August 2020 speech at the Democratic National Convention. See if you can spot the epiphany.
History has thrust one more urgent task on us. Will we be the generation that finally wipes out the stain of racism from our national character? I believe we're up to it. I believe we're ready. Just a week ago yesterday was the 3rd anniversary of the events in Charlottesville. Close your eyes. Remember what you saw on television. Remember seeing those neo-Nazis and Klansmen and white supremacists coming out of fields with lighted torches, veins bulging, spewing the same anti-Semitic bile heard across Europe in the 30s. Remember the violent clash that ensued between those spreading hate and those with the courage to stand against it. And remember what the president said when asked? He said there were, quote, very fine people on both sides. It was a wake-up call for us as a country, and for me, a call to action. At that moment, I knew I'd have to run, because my father taught us that silence was complicity, and I could never remain silent or complicit. At the time, I said we were in the battle for the soul of this nation. And we are.
Okay. Did you spot the epiphany? Did you hear it? It was the phrase, "At that moment, I knew." So, threw you a little bit of a curveball there, pulled a little of a bait and switch, you know what I'm saying? Because "at that moment, I knew" is actually cliche cousin to "suddenly everything changed. But this is how much I believe in you. I just knew you would figure that out." And people use them pretty much interchangeably. And it's really bad when they're used together. So Biden could have gone for the full "suddenly everything changed and at that moment I knew," but he spared us and just went with one. And so you're trying to tell me that this guy was vice president for 8 years and then watched Hillary Clinton lose and then watched Trump in office for 4 years, and it never occurred to him until the summer of 2017, "I must run for president of the United States." No way. Without even doing any research, I know for sure that can't be true. And part of the reason I know is because Biden used a cliche to mark his moment of realization. This is super fucking important. Whenever you hear the phrases, "suddenly everything changed," or "at that moment I knew," right? Or anytime you hear a cliche, it is a signal that there is a superficial shortcut of thought happening. People resort to those phrases because they either don't want or don't think they should take the time, or can't, right? Or can't take the time to actually work through how their thoughts and behaviors actually changed. Cliches are always mental shortcuts that cover over all of the complexities of being a human being. The epiphany, in particular, covers over the complexities of persuasion, of behavioral and intellectual change. Instead of explaining how persuasion happened, right, how Biden actually decided to run for president, the epiphany is a shortcut. Now, I don't know why Biden didn't actually tell us about how he decided to run for president. I also don't know that I care. It's like, yeah, you were vice president for 8 years. You probably came up with some good ideas. Watching Trump shit on the country for 4 years probably got your fucking motor going. You had a good chance of winning. The DNC liked you. You're a white man, so you ran for president. Makes sense. There's not even a need for an epiphany here because Biden running for president already makes total sense. Like, if Biden had gone to work every day as a banker for 10 years, and then on the morning of the 11th year, woke up and said, this morning, I suddenly knew I needed to go to work. You'd be like, yeah, duh. Oh, why wouldn't you? That's how this feels. Now, if Biden the banker had said, "This morning I suddenly knew I needed to be a dolphin trainer," then I'd understand the need for an epiphany. And because it's a drastic change of behavior demanding an epiphany, I would need like a little more information than just, "Well, I woke up this morning and everything changed." Because no one's brain works like that. So as it turns out, little research done here, Biden not only was probably thinking about running for president the minute he thought about running for VP with Obama back in 08, 09, he actually was already thinking about it in 1998, right? 1998. So this is a long-ass epiphany, like 30 years. So here's the New York Times doing a quick summary of what they call Biden's disastrous 1998 bid.
The next president of the United States, Joe Biden.
It's June 9th, 1987, and then Senator Joseph R. Biden Jr. has just entered the presidential race. Look familiar? The 2020 race is Biden's third attempt at the Oval Office. He first ran for president 32 years ago. For those who may have forgotten or weren't around in 87, here's what happened. Biden started off as a strong contender.
Senator Joseph R. Biden Jr. of Delaware.
But his campaign was marred by some early blunders, like this one.
What law school did you attend, and where did you place in that class? And the other question is...
I think I probably have a much higher IQ than you do, I suspect.
And he exaggerated his academic record in law school.
Went back to law school, and in fact ended up in the top half of my class.
And then there were moments like this, repeated later during the campaign.
When I marched in the civil rights movement, I marched with tens of thousands of others to change attitudes.
But he never actually marched in the civil rights movement at all. Ultimately, it was accusations of plagiarism in his speeches.
I did not know that was a Robert Kennedy quote. My mistake.
That forced him to drop out of the race.
I made some mistakes.
All right, well, real quick. I just realized I said 1988. So actually, an extra 10 years he's been having these epiphanies. Yeah, so first presidential bid, 1988. My bad. We have now learned two things. One, Biden didn't have an epiphany during Charlottesville. He may have had his conviction renewed or been re-reminded of his mission or been given a renewed charge or whatever. Could have said any of that. But an epiphany, he did not have. Two, we get a better understanding of what the epiphany cliche is doing for Biden. The epiphany recast Biden's obvious lifelong interest in being the big P with a commitment to social justice. This strategy makes a lot of sense. We know that race politics were a deciding factor in the 2020 election. We know that Biden's appeal to non-white voters was a real area of concern. Of course, Biden is going to want to bring up his commitment to inclusion and enfranchisement for Black Americans as often as he can. It's just good strategy. Until Biden uses a lazy-ass cliche to make the connection to racial justice. Then he comes across as manipulative. And the epiphany gets worse when you hear some of Biden's backstory about fibbing about being part of the Civil Rights March. Cringy. And then it gets worser when you take into account the weird stuff he would say during the 2020 campaign about, like, quote, like being loved by the blacks, right? So there's a big Biden civil rights problem soup. So the epiphany that Biden hopes will give you this sudden inspirational smack in the face during the DNC about his love for Black America does in fact quite the opposite. He would have actually been significantly better off if he had just taken the time to really explain the twisty-turny connections between racial justice and his bid for presidency, right? Acknowledge the civil rights thing. Bring up Charlottesville. Talk about this as a lifelong commitment. Don't turn it into this sudden moment when you knew. And to really add icing on the cliche cake, Biden actually goes on in the DNC speech to precisely not use an epiphany, proving he's perfectly capable of not taking the mental shortcut. Here's the piece of the speech that comes right after Biden's Charlottesville moment.
You know, one of the most important conversations I've had this entire campaign, it was with someone who was much too young to vote. I met with 6-year-old Gianna Floyd the day before her daddy, George Floyd, was laid to rest. She's an incredibly brave little girl. And I'll never forget it. When I leaned down to speak to her, she looked in my eyes and she said, and I quote, "Daddy changed the world. Daddy changed the world." Her words burrowed deep into my heart. Maybe George Floyd's murder was a breaking point. Maybe John Lewis's passing the inspiration. But however it's come to be, however it's happened, America's ready, in John's words, to lay down, quote, the heavy burden of hate at last, and to end the hard work of rooting out our systemic racism.
Notice the difference. Before, it was all about certainty. I saw Charlottesville and I just knew. As if your brain just has an on-off switch, and that is how it makes decisions. But after his encounter with Floyd's daughter, it's maybe, right? Maybe Floyd's murder was the breaking point. Maybe John Lewis dying was the inspiration. He repeats it twice. And just in case you don't know, John Lewis was a civil rights leader, a black politician from Georgia, who died of cancer a few weeks before Biden's address. So, again, the civil rights motif here is very strong for Biden. Now, we can say what we will about Biden name-dropping dead black men to make his bid for the presidency. Certainly, it feels a little cringy. Also, it would have felt equally as cringy for him not to do it, given it was on everyone's minds. He's a white man, he wants to lead the country, and John Lewis had just died, right? So we'll leave that aside. But what I'm focused on is that Biden ditches the epiphanies in the last part of the speech and instead puts the peripeteia back where it belongs, in the events that happen outside of us. Is Floyd's murder a peripeteia? An intervention of fate? A sudden reversal of fortune? Maybe. Biden essentially leaves that open to possibility because it's only going to be a reversal of fortune if something gets fucking done about it. That's not cliche, right? That's legit what Biden should be saying, because that's how life works, especially when it comes to systemic racism. Events happen, and their significance is how we think and act about them, right? So that's why Biden says the hard work of rooting out systemic racism. That's why the John Lewis quote is helpful here. Events don't just happen and then lightning bolts of inspiration strike us from the sky. That's why an epiphany is a cliche, right? It's a shortcut. It keeps us from doing the work. I mean, really think about all these phrases that we're using all of the time. Suddenly everything changed. At that moment I knew. Do they feel right to you? Is that how your life works? That was the moment I knew. She was the one for me. Oh, really? And then what about 6 weeks later when you caught her clipping her toenails in the bedroom? Was she the one for you then? You know what I mean? As a culture, like, we hold tight to our epiphanies because, well, it's easier, right? I think, than the reality, which is that persuasion takes a lot of time. It's incremental. And, like, it's really hard to track. Who fucking knows exactly when you are persuaded to think something or do something new? Maybe it's going to be New Year's 2021. Maybe it's not. It's really all in how you spend the year of 2021. It's not in the moment the clock changes. I can tell you this before I wrap up. If you treat the new year like an epiphany, your transformation is going to be short-lived, if not non-existent. And then, instead of doing the hard work of getting the change you want, you're going to be looking for the next epiphany to strike, right? Waiting for and this is what we do with civil rights. We wait for the next martyr instead of just being like, you know what? Maybe we should just do some shit now. If you treat the new year like a peripeteia, right? This event that presents the opportunity for a sudden reversal of fortune, you're going to have better luck. Just like we all will if that's how we treat race. At the very least, let's just ditch the epiphanies moving forward. If you want to inspire or be inspired, figure out how change happens and learn how to explain that thoughtfully to other people.
Become a little less cliche with each new episode of Rhetorically Speaking dropping every Tuesday. Be sure to hit subscribe and leave a review on whatever app you use to listen. Don't be a digital freeloader, you're better than that.